I would like to welcome to this year's Shoshana Shier Distinguished Visiting Professor. But before I do that, I do our land acknowledgement, which I do in the abbreviated form. I don't totally extemporalize, so I won't bring in fraud, theft, and any other things, but we should officially do the acknowledgement of the land of those people who roamed here before us, and which we mistake to have been inviting us here and using it. I think that's how it should be properly said. And I usually don't like to say Turtle Island because Mendelssohn has a whole thing about how to translate. It means probably something like a continent or a big chunk of land on which people live, because even at those times, people knew how to speak metaphorically. So the Shoshana Shier Distinguished Visiting Professorship was established in 1994 by the late Milton Shier and his family to honor his late wife of 48 years, Shoshana Rose Lillian Shier, an alumna of the University of Toronto who actually graduated here with a BA from Wordsworth College. Since its inception, the professorship has brought in distinguished scholars, and then here sometimes we rattle on some names, but we have a great name here, so we don't do that, who have enriched and continue to enrich, I can guarantee that, the programming at the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, and indeed the university, by teaching undergraduate and graduate courses and giving this lecture series to community and university audience. Both are here tonight. We are very grateful to the Shier family for their remarkable generosity and ongoing effort and support. And now it is an especially great pleasure to introduce to you an old friend of mine, Eddie. Eddie is, in fact, one of the oldest friends from this part of the world when we were both graduate students, both in a strange foreign land south the border where we all care right now is how it's going to come out. That's where we met as graduate students, pursuing degrees in completely different fields. We met over one of the subjects, like one on this part of the yard, the other on that side of the yard. We met over one of the subjects we both care deeply and continue to care. A subject that connects Jewish intellectual history and German studies, though we seem to be pretty much the only ones thinking so at the time, and not much seems to have changed since. We seem still to be pretty much the only ones who care about that. I'm talking, of course, about the one great figure that defines the life of modern Jewish thought, like no other else, that is Moses Mendelssohn. For many years, Eddie has been teaching at the Hebrew University at Jerusalem. He is the authority, and he really is, and you know I don't use that word often, when it comes to Mendelssohn's Hebrew writings, which he has expertly translated, edited, and very generously commented in an erudite and aplomb way, in a beautiful Vedic volume, which is really worth looking at, published by Yale University Press, and which is actually, and I have to say that, a scholarly feat that is still yet to be more widely recognized for the treasure it holds. It's really quite something. And Michael, I see him nodding. We used it when we had our Mendelssohn reading group here a few years ago, extensively. Currently, Eddie is working on a collaborative project with Marc Brettler from Duke University, examining the Jewish reception of modern critical scholarship on the Bible. Another project I'm particularly looking forward that he mentioned to me is his plan to write a book-length study of Moses Mendelssohn. So we sort of play tags, like he writes something, I write something, he writes something, I write something, totally out of phase. It's all good. His lecture today is the first of three lectures of this year's Shoshana Shier Distinguishing Visiting Professor lecture series, as it's called, on the subject, on the umbrella subject, Jews and the Challenges of Modern Biblical Criticism. And today's lecture explores the first part in his first lecture, which is, and so this is another rhetorical question, I think. Rhetorical can also mean in two ways. It's not exactly clear which answer is expected. That's important about the rhetorical. People seem to forget that. Was Spinoza really the father of modern biblical criticism? Please welcome Eddie Breuer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Goethe, for that warm welcome. And it is always nice to be greeted by someone you met originally decades ago in a very different context. We were both much younger, I would say at the time. And thank you to the Center for Jewish Studies here, my lovely hosts, and you really have all been wonderful, and my colleagues that I'm getting to know. It really has been a pleasure, and I look forward, and we're halfway through the semester, but I look forward to the time that remains. Thank you, of course, to the Shier family for making this possible, and I say that sincerely. Let me jump in. I think there's a lot to cover. And yes, the context, the 3 lectures I'm giving here all have to do with the project that I'm doing with Marc Brettler, Jews and the Reception of Biblical Criticism. So let me just take a couple of minutes to frame that, to explain that, and then we will jump in. Biblical criticism can be explained simply as the modern scholarly, largely academic study of the Hebrew Bible, which really broadly, again, very broadly, breaks down into 2 subsections, if you will. One is a look at the received text of the Hebrew Bible. We have the Hebrew Bible. The field of biblical criticism asks questions about the text. How old is the text? When did it come into being? Was it always in the form that we have before us? Has the text changed over time? If it did, when? Under what circumstances? That is one part of what biblical criticism does. The other half of what biblical criticism does, again, this is really a huge area, is ask questions about composition. Where did these narratives, laws, histories, teachings, where did they come from? Who may have authored them? When may they have been authored? Even after the texts themselves had been authored or came into some being, had they been redacted further as time went on? And again, by what processes did all this take place? That, in a nutshell, if I have to do it al regel achat, standing on one leg, is sort of the field of biblical criticism. But I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm a historian. And my interest here in the field is, number one, in the development of biblical criticism as an academic endeavor, which I'm a modern historian, and this is a modern question. 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, now the 21st century. So I'm interested in the kinds of questions Bible scholars ask about the Bible. I'm asking about the field of biblical criticism as a field. Where did it come from? What were the circumstances? What shapes it? Have the questions changed? What brings about the formulation of the questions? Have the conclusions changed? And again, what brings about the shift, if you will, in the field? And it's a fascinating field, and it's really deep and endless in many ways. But I'm not a general historian. I'm a historian interested in the modern Jewish experience. So I actually take this one step further, which is to say I'm not interested in the Bible. I'm not so much interested, of course, I have to be aware of what's going on biblically. I have to be aware of the development of the field of biblical criticism, but I'm actually interested in what Jews do with all of this. In other words, a number of questions. At what point do Jews from the 17th or 18th century onward become aware of these new ways, new critical ways of studying the Bible? And by the way, don't take that for granted, because Jews aren't always completely aware, or they're only partially aware. And that's part of the issue that one needs to figure out. But I'm interested in, once they become aware, to what degree have they absorbed these new critical approaches? To what degree have they rejected them? And actually, frankly, what's most interesting is not so much what they've absorbed or rejected, but that middle ground, what they are constantly negotiating in terms of what is and isn't either acceptable or not, or etc. So that's where the project comes. It's absolutely a wonderful project, which people always ask me, are you moving forward? And I say, no, we're not moving forward. We're moving laterally. Because as we go, we just find more and more and more. I don't quite know how we're going to dig our way out of this, but we will hopefully find a way to do that. Now, just a minute more, the 3 lectures, well, this is the first, and I will just get into that in a minute. The three lectures are quite different. The second one in particular is really quite different, it's a very historical lecture, almost micro-history, in terms of focusing on mid-Victorian England, middle of the 19th century, has to do with a certain great Bible scholar who largely has been buried. So part of it is just me resurrecting him, and part of it is actually asking the question of why was he forgotten? Which is to say how the British, the Anglo-Jews did a masterful job in trying to bury a controversy. So that will be the second. The third talk actually will be the one that gives you a broader overview, if you will. It can't be a complete overview because then again, we'd be here for hours and hours, but it will attempt something of an overview, and as well as actually trying to share with you maybe some archival material that I found that Marc and I are working on together. Okay, that's all the introduction. And now to this afternoon's talk. This afternoon's talk actually is about beginnings. Where does all this begin? And to some degree also a question of methods. I have to say, as long as Marc and I have been on this project, and I'm often asked the question of, well, where's Spinoza in this whole picture? Or are you beginning with Spinoza? I'm asked this in various, and of course I've thought about this, and I've pondered and thought about this. Today's lecture is a little part of the answer. It's not the complete answer, as you'll see. I think it's part of the answer. And honestly, there's some wonderful scholars sitting around this table, and I very much need your feedback and look forward to it. So I begin with the question of Spinoza. Is he, in fact, where we begin the picture? Benedictus de Spinoza, for those of you who don't know, or Baruch de Spinoza. The years are 1632 to 1677, and in particular, we're interested not in all his writings, but the Theological-Political Tractatus, and it's published in late 1669 or early in 1670, anonymously initially, but the cat is out of the bag, and the authorship is known. It's a rich and fascinating, challenging, and difficult book by any measure. Some years ago, when I began to think about this and look at this, I started surveying the literature, right? That's what one does when one begins. What do other scholars say about this? Well, the generalists, as far as I could tell, philosophers, historians, do fairly come down on this idea that Spinoza plays a central role in the development of biblical criticism. That's a fairly common thing you'll find. Specialists, and now what I mean is intellectual historians of the 16th and 17th century, so now a very different kind of group, they are more careful and equivocal about the question. And I think this is something that, again, is part of what I have to say about this. Scholars like Noel Malcolm, who writes on Hobbes, but it's relevant here, Richard Popkin, Anthony Grafton, and quite recently there's a new scholar, Timothy Twinney, who's done some really interesting work. Again, their conclusion is that if you actually look carefully at the late 16th and right through the 17th century, again, remember the dates here, Spinoza's Tractatus appears in 1670, that there is a robust field of biblical scholarship, of biblical writings. And that, and many of them really say, well, when you actually look at this literature, it does change the picture somewhat on how we evaluate Spinoza's contribution. Bible scholars, again, as I'm still reviewing the field, Bible scholars are interesting. They tend to really range on the question. Some Bible scholars, unquestionably, Spinoza is a pioneer of the critical study of the Hebrew Bible. I think of even, let's say, Thomas Cheney is writing right at the end of the 19th century, one of the first English language scholars to survey the field. He'll say, he uses the word pioneer, unquestionably. Other scholars, when you actually look again at Bible scholars who are interested in telling the story of their own field, of the development of their own field, and I find that interesting, of course, they skip over Spinoza, or they'll give him one sentence or two sentences in an otherwise longer introduction, and they'll land on other figures who tend to be in the 18th century, Jean Struck, Johann Eichhorn, and others as the true fathers of biblical criticism. I will also tell you that I've noticed something of a nativist trend, and I think I have a bit of a smile because this is not surprising and it could be sometimes a little amusing. French scholars tend to play up the role of Frenchmen. So when you look at what French scholars have to say about the question of the beginnings of biblical criticism. They'll mention Richard Simon, Jean Leclerc, Jean Astruc, various 17th and 18th century figures. English scholars, well, they'll look at Thomas Hobbes, Robert Lowth, Benjamin Kennicott. There's another scholar that tends to be lesser known, Alexander Geddes, a Scotsman, right at the end of the 18th century. So the British scholars, the German scholars, never mind. It's quite obvious what the German scholars will say. And now I come to the Jewish scholars. So what do Jewish scholars do on the question of Spinoza and biblical criticism? And you won't be surprised, of course, here's where Spinoza really is given front and center. I think of Menachem or Max Soloveitchik and Zalman Rubashov, their Toldot Bikorat HaMikra, 1925, very important. The first sort of Hebrew language history of the field, meaning telling the story of the field, devotes a whole chapter to Spinoza. Of course, in a certain sense, they do more than that. They're really claiming the whole field for Jews. They'll tell you that even the Talmud begins to ask critical questions. I mean, it's interesting in terms of that, but that's 1925. It's come forward, scholars like James Kugel, excellent scholars, right? James Kugel, Baruch Schwartz, they do something of the same. They absolutely are pushing Spinoza out there. So when I say that there's a bit of a nativist tradition here, what can I say? It's there. Just grab. My interest this afternoon is a fresh look. A fresh look. I don't think everything I'm going to say is original, not at all, but I still tried to give it a fresh look. Again, the question of Spinoza's Theological-Political Tractatus and the question of how important is it or what role does it play in the development of biblical criticism. So first I begin with the circumstances of the writing of the Tractatus. Spinoza in the 1660s was working on his ethics, his magnum opus, clearly by any measure his most important work, his great contribution, when he broke off the writing of the ethics to work on the Tractatus, 1665. Why does he do that? Well, he was worried. Again, this is a story well known. I just have to relate it to you. He was worried about the political situation in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands, and in particular, the impact of religious disputes and the power of the churchmen and the theologians on the political realm. In this, he joins other great thinkers, writers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Spinoza, really are facing the question du jour. Really, and unquestionably, those who sort of study the 17th century, those interested in political philosophy, know that the real question here is the proper delineation of the relationship of church and state. How, the sovereign, the civic authority versus the theologians and the churchmen. This is a great issue. There's a tremendous amount of tension and friction going on here. Spinoza, like Hobbes before him, and joining other Erastians, is something of, again, for those of you who know and enjoy and are interested in political philosophy, there's a group here that are convinced that the best approach is actually to limit or restrain the church officials, the theologians, that that's the proper way to deal with this tension of church and state. In other words, to again, as I said, to restrain them from encroaching on the political or civic realm. Spinoza, again, like Hobbes, realized that one approach here was to shake or undermine the cornerstone of religious dogma, which was namely the authority of Scripture. Hobbes does this in this Leviathan, chapter 33. Unlike Hobbes, and this is what really is, I think, remarkable and unique about Spinoza, he makes this the centerpiece. The question of the authority of Scripture, for Spinoza, that's the key to addressing this problem, this tension of the relationship of the church, of teaching, of churchmen and of theologians in the political realm. And this is exactly what Spinoza does in his Tractatus. He devotes the vast majority of it, quite frankly, to discussing the nature of prophecy, the nature of biblical law, the nature of miracles, the nature of the ancient Hebrew Republic, and important for us, a whole chapter devoted to the interpretation of Scripture. This is what he does from the center. You wouldn't expect this necessarily in a book of political philosophy. This really was, I think, Spinoza's importance here. This is unquestionable. The sum of the Tractatus on this issue, on this political issue, is that a proper reading of Scripture, a proper understanding of the Bible, leads to the conclusion state this as clearly as I can, basically using Spinoza's words, is that the Bible taught only simple doctrines that suffice for right conduct, demanding nothing from us but piety, he means civic piety, and obedience. That is the sum of what Scripture, what the Bible has to teach. Spinoza's reading of the Bible, and in fact his entire project, was thus, in a word, deflationary. That's not my term. I didn't come up with that term, but to me, it's the best one word I have to explain what Spinoza is doing. It is deflationary in the sense that he's saying that a proper reading of the Bible, proper reading of Scripture, would show us, would teach us that the Bible demands far less from us what is claimed in the name of the church, in the name of religion, in the name of, by the churchmen and by the theologians. It is minimalist, and that's what I mean when I use the word deflationary. In Spinoza's terms, and again, this is now the way he's putting it, there's nothing in the Bible that can or should teach us or justifies the constraint on our conscience, our thinking, or our beliefs. That is the bottom line. That is, again, the brilliance and the greatness and the importance of what Spinoza is doing here. Again, this political framing is important, but for our interest today, we're cutting away now to is chapter 7, as I said, because we have to sort of cut to the chase. Chapter 7, aptly titled On the Interpretation of Scripture. Okay, so this is now, one can argue, the heart of this work. Notice, by the way, that's not chapter 1, it's chapter 7. This is actually a point Leo Strauss and others make appropriately. But let us turn and look at this chapter 7. I will just begin first by quoting some of the well-known lines, but I think we need to hear him, and we need to hear it, Spinoza's voice as well as we can in English, not in Latin. Spinoza laid out the path to determine the true meaning of Scripture, and he does so as follows, I quote, "The true method of interpreting Scripture is no different than the method of interpreting nature, which," he goes on to explain, "requires us to make a straightforward study of Scripture, and from this, to deduce by logical inference the meaning of the authors of Scripture." Spinoza explained that because the Bible contains narratives, revelation, which cannot be known by, quote unquote, the natural light, of course for him the natural light of reason, the meaning of Scripture, and again I quote, must be sought from Scripture alone, just as the knowledge of nature must be sought from nature itself. These are Spinoza's words. This is in a nutshell, and I think that's a fair presentation of what he is saying. Now, precisely because Spinoza is well-schooled in medieval Jewish philosophy and in medieval Jewish biblical interpretation, I mean, this is clearly where he comes from, I think we would do well by framing this in the following way. From Sa'adja Gaon through to the Ibn Tibbon, from basically the 10th century to the 12th or 13th century, you have a tradition, we shorthand would refer to it as a Sephardic tradition, of how to approach and how to interpret the Bible. In that tradition, there's already been a great deal of grammatical and philological work done. It's already a rich body. And what you have, again, a formulation from Sa'adja through to the Ibn Tibbons, is as follows. That one must read the Bible according to the rules, the grammatical and philological rules that we have, except in 3 circumstances. In other words, only 3 times are we justified in deviating from or in leaving what would otherwise be the proper philological and grammatical interpretation. And those 3 are, number 1, reason. And what they really mean are philosophical or scientific postulates. So again, if a philosophical or scientific postulate says or teaches us that Scripture could not possibly mean what it says, so then we can deviate from the meaning. The other one is a contradiction, let's say, between various biblical passages, so that one part of the Bible is essentially demanding us or forcing us to deviate again from the philological or grammatical meaning. And the third is tradition. And really what they meant is the definitive legal halachic tradition. So that if something in tradition demands a different read of the verse, then again. So only under these conditions does one normally abandon the philological, grammatical kinds of readings. What Spinoza does, essentially, in the 7th chapter of the Tractatus is insist on the primacy of the grammatical philological reading, but rejecting the accommodation, if you will, to pshat, to the straightforward, whatever different other words you might use, rejecting the accommodation either for philosophy and science on the one hand, or tradition on the other hand. In other words, where there was a threefold kind of, well, these are the only times you could abandon a straightforward philological grammatical reading. What he says is, no. Only what's left is, of course, only one thing. Only when other biblical verses demand some kind of a deviation from it. And this is what he does. So he therefore rejects reason, philosophy, science as a justifiable means of interpreting scripture, and the same for tradition. That's effectively what he's removing. So again, when framed this way, you realize he's coming from somewhere. There is this tradition, but he's removing at least 2 of the 3 conditions. Now, in chapter 7, Spinoza explains, and I want to go back now to his own explanation of his method. He essentially has 3 prongs, if you will, to the proper interpretation of scripture. The first, to study, and again I quote, the nature and properties of the language in which the Bible was written. Very swiftly and smartly adding, from established linguistic usage. So we are interested in exactly the nature and properties of the language, but again, with attention to established usage. That was number 1. Number 2, to collate biblical statements according to their true meaning. So that, again, we look at how the Bible deals with this issue in various places, and we collate them, twice warning us, of course, that whatever we do, that's a fair reading, but we should not allow for reason or preconceived ideas to dictate how we read the Bible. And the third, this is clearly important, is to examine the circumstances relevant to all the books of the prophets. That is, when the author wrote, for whom, and in what language. And he adds, importantly, on what occasion and at what period and for what nation the teachings were recorded. Again, really very important. And he lays this out, he offers us a few examples that I might come to later, depending on how we do for time. Now, this articulation of Spinoza is unquestionably impressive, although, as I've already said, and I will say this, I think once or twice more, there's less novelty here, I think, than meets the eye than both he and what later scholars claim. In other words, the first 2 components, when he talks about the nature and properties of the language, and to collate, if you will, any biblical verse with other biblical verses, that clearly is far less novel than what he may pretend or not pretend. The novelty, if anything, is the third, the historical. When did the authors write? What did they mean? In what language, etc. Okay, after laying out this approach, Spinoza does something that's important and, on the face of it, intellectually honest. He should be praised for that, where he points to, and I quote here, difficulties and shortcomings in our method. And he lists right there and then 6 problems that stand in the way of determining the true meaning of Scripture. How lovely and how honest. He points out problems with the meanings of words, meaning we can't really truly determine the meanings of words. Ambiguities in the Hebrew tenses, ambiguous conjunctions and adverbs, the late addition of vocalization, again, for those of you who know Hebrew. He piles on these problems to say, all of this gets in the way of interpreting it. And then he goes on, as if this is not enough, to concede that we also cannot provide an account of the history of the biblical books, since we have no knowledge of their authors, no knowledge of the versions of the books, no knowledge of the original languages. Sums up by saying, again, I quote, "These difficulties I consider so grave that I have no hesitation in affirming that we either do not know the true meaning of Scripture, or we can do no more than make conjecture." So where does that leave us? Spinoza answers that question basically by reaffirming his fundamental claim that runs right through the Tractatus, meaning it leaves us where exactly he wants us to be, that the Bible only teaches matters that are, quote unquote, readily apprehended and easily understood. Simple doctrines, as I alluded to before, meaning civic piety and obedience. In other words, what Spinoza is doing at this point, this is chapter 7, and this is all laid out very clearly, is look, we don't have any means of truly understanding the Hebrew Bible, but it doesn't matter. What he's done here, okay, in terms of the broader political aims of the Tractatus, is something quite brilliant. He's landed a double punch aimed right at the theologians and the churchmen. He's saying to them, you think you understand scripture? You don't, because there's no way of understanding scripture. And frankly, and if you want to know what it means, if you do want to glean some understanding, it's not what you think it is. The messages are far more simpler than all these great dogmatic ideas that you're trying to hoist and therefore sort of muscle your way in politically. So this is really something important. Now, seconds. But Spinoza is not done. That's chapter 7. He's not done in that he moves on to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, very famously, he takes up the question of the authorship of the Pentateuch and of the other books. Very important. And here, seemingly, he's taking this third approach, the authors, when books were written and for whom, etc., and applying them. By examining, and I quote again, the circumstances relevant to all the books of the prophets. What Spinoza argues, just now I really do have to sort of just, give you the essence of this, is that the evidence drawn from the Pentateuch, largely looking at anachronisms, but other evidence, is that it would suggest that it was actually written by someone other than Moses. It has to have been later. And he concludes that this was written, in fact, many, many generations later by Ezra, 5th century of the BCE. Now, again, this does deserve, broader treatment, and I realize, that I am, really, shooting and running. But let me focus on 3 aspects of this claim. Again, that the biblical books have to have, by the evidence that he cites, have to have been written much later. He's citing the 12th century Ibn Ezra. This is, again, very well known. But point number 1 is, again, based on good scholarship done by Noel Malcolm and et al. And others, is that the question and the problem of the anachronisms evident, really, in the Pentateuch were widely discussed in the 16th and 17th century. In other words, number 1, what we have to realize is that this is not, entirely new. This is not Spinoza's great realization when, again, many of these questions really had been asked and were debated and were discussed. Point number 2, Spinoza's application of his own method. Okay, so let's just begin by noting that in chapter 7, he spent, as I sort of read through it with you, he said, look, this is what we need to do, but we can't do it because of all the problems in the text. We are left with a text that we cannot understand. You notice though what's happened. Somewhere between chapter 7 and chapter 8, he has suddenly recovered a degree of confidence that in fact we can understand the Bible. And suddenly he's drawing the conclusions that he wants. That's number 1. I mean, there's something that goes on here that we shouldn't let go. Ironically, perhaps not, the biblical evidence, honestly, on the question of authorship might arguably be far more ambiguous. It is ambiguous, but again, now suddenly he's not allowing for that ambiguity. Now suddenly he's insistent that the author has to be, he says it's a conjecture, a presupposition, but then he runs with it as if Ezra is really the author. And so the third, and on this aspect, the third thing I want to note is as follows. Why Ezra? And what's his treatment of Ezra? And again, simply stated, I'll tell you, Ezra is not a prophet here. Ezra is a political figure. And that's how he's reading him, and that's how he's using it. And this is done very much on purpose, and this is cast in distinctly political terms. Because what Spinoza is trying to do, and again, for good reason within the body of the Tractatus, is to argue that the authority of Scripture rests entirely on human and political grounds. He is making the Bible into a fundamentally political text. This is exactly what it does. Again, it's a brilliant move, absolutely serves it. But this is how and why he's dealing with the whole question of art. Okay, let me now try to step back and to broaden this out after I've done that. So this is now a different part of the talk. To my mind, and this is how I originally actually conceived of this talk, there are, I think, three ways fairly of evaluating, the importance of Spinoza to the development of biblical criticism. One, to compare Spinoza to his predecessors and contemporaries. How novel is he? Second, to look at the Tractatus itself, the articulation of his method and the application of those methods. And three, to look at his influence or impact on later scholarship, right? So it's the before, during, if you will, and after. Okay, I think that's all very straightforward, and that's what I think. Now, let me then reflect on this. In terms of his predecessors and contemporaries, I've already alluded to this a number of times, so what I'm about to say is, I think, already evident. That the sum of the last 30 or so years of research shows, I think convincingly, certainly to me, that Spinoza is far less original than meets the eye. We have too many thinkers, texts, writings that just play over so much of the same ground that he covers. Edward Curley, and again, I'm giving him credit here, does argue, even acknowledging that it's far less novel, is that certainly Spinoza should be given credit for pulling this together in an impressive way. That is true. There is something impressive in that. But in of themselves, the various arguments in the various parts, I think, number one, don't show for a great degree of novelty. There's no sort of new research or new insight here. So that's the predecessor. In terms of the Tractatus itself, well, that's what I spent most of the first part of the talk today. And quite frankly, and again, you can, this, what I was saying, and in my reading, what I'm trying to say is that Spinoza does not take his own principles very seriously. He's pointing out all kinds of incredibly important problems, but then he says it doesn't matter. And he's not really developing it. And he doesn't in any serious way develop them. If I could, maybe now let me pivot for a minute to point this out. In chapter 7, Spinoza uses only 2 or 3 biblical examples. In other words, it's not chock full of examples at that point. Let me just point out the two of the examples, the main examples, and show you what I think that, well, let me give you the examples and then I'll sort of comment on it. One has to do with Deuteronomy 4, verse 24, God is a devouring fire, a jealous God. Spinoza says, look, Moses writes, God is a devouring fire. As far as I'm concerned, that's what Moses believed, unless I'm told otherwise, that God is fire. Well, let's bring in other biblical verses to show how we should interpret this. So again, he's asking the question, he's interested in linguistic usage, and what he does is find a verse in Job 31:12 that answers the question. It says yes, yes, yes. So it's metaphorical. But again, I'm not going to just take it as metaphorical because my mind tells me that you can't say God is fire, right? That wouldn't be fair. We need good linguistic evidence. The problem is that Spinoza tells us not once, not twice, not three, but three times that Job was probably a Gentile author and that this book is actually probably translated into Hebrew, meaning it was written in another language. Now, this doesn't mean that Spinoza is wrong about, how Job should come and answer the problem of Deuteronomy. But it does mean that, well, at least stop for a minute and do the serious work. Meaning, because if it was a Gentile, then it's not really part of this textual tradition. And if it was translated from another language, well, hold on a second, we all know about translations. Translations are tricky. But he doesn't care. And that's the point here. He's not, he himself, I think, in my reading of this, is not taking his own methods too seriously. The same thing comes in another example where he offers quotes from Matthew 5:39, the Sermon on the Mount. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer him the other cheek. Lovely, says Spinoza. Now again, one has to look at the context fairly, but Spinoza then says, and that's exactly like a verse in Jeremiah from Lamentations 3:30. Again, he could be entirely right. This could be entirely fair. But hold on, one is in the New Testament, one is in the Old Testament. There are something like 7 centuries between them. So what happens to the question of asking about who authored it, at what age, in what context? Again, he just simply skips over that. More broadly, if you read through the Tractatus, you see how many times, not always, but plenty of times, Spinoza talks about scripture. But what he means is the Old and the New Testament together, which again might be entirely fair, but it might not be. Different languages, perhaps, right? Different contexts, vastly different contexts. But it doesn't matter again. In other words, he doesn't seem to want to apply or implement the kinds of ideas that he has developed there. Okay, let me just now, these were the examples that I wasn't sure I was going to pull in. So I said there are 3 ways of evaluating. I said, looking at his predecessors, looking at the Tractatus itself. That's what I just addressed now. And I do really have struggled with understanding Spinoza and how seriously he wanted to implement his own methods. And the third, and admittedly, this is a whole other lecture, which I'm not going to subject you to now, and frankly, would demand, I think, even much more work on my part. I'm willing to do it, but not right now, is the question of the influence and impact on later scholarship. Meaning, fine, everything is fair, but perhaps, nevertheless, other scholars did take what he did and move it forward. In my assessment, at least in my, I would call it interim assessment, I think one is hard-pressed to see the influence when you look at Richard Simon, who wrote only 8 years after him, Jean Struck, Johann Eichhorn, and others. And when you look at sort of the important scholars going down the line, they don't cite Spinoza. Of course, you could say, well, it's because he's too dangerous to cite. And I accept that, I understand that, I really do, but I don't see it. I don't see that his arguments are central and his ideas are central to what they are doing. It just does need more careful discussion. I'm the first to concede that, but I just, again, as I said, I don't really see that. What might be helpful, and this is going to be the last little part here, is to comment on the ways in which 18th century biblical scholarship does not follow Spinoza. In other words, I think there's a different way to maybe tackle this. First of all, a general comment. 18th and 19th century biblical criticism, as we know it and have it, I would argue, is not deflationary. It's not interested. It doesn't have the same agenda. It is not interested in impugning the Bible. It actually takes the Bible very seriously. It actually says that the Bible has meaning. We can determine the meaning. And that's by and large what these scholars are doing. They are setting out to do just that. In other words, it's scholarship done very much in the appreciation of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, of course, there's also New Testament scholarship, but I'm interested here in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. Point number 2. One of the major lines of biblical work done both before and after Spinoza, it's very important, both before and after, is the whole question of the textual witnesses. Meaning, how do we determine the text of the Bible? And how do we come to understand it? Well, one of the things that we do is we use other translations or other versions, the Targumim, the Aramaic versions, the Septuagint or other Greek versions, and the great discovery of the 17th century, the Samaritan Bible, which already had been published, was clearly there, doesn't interest Spinoza, never mentions it. And quite frankly, he's not interested in this whole question. And this is a great deal of the 17th century scholarship. And it also ends up being a great deal of the scholarship that follows Spinoza into the 18th and the 19th century. Scholars spend a great amount of time on this. And it becomes one of the pillars, I would suggest, in terms of where biblical criticism goes. He's just not there. Until the end of the 18th century, scholars like Struck, Eichhorn assumed the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. Eichhorn, in his earlier editions, the first editions of his Anleitung, of his introduction, absolutely does assume it, then he abandons it. And this is what's important. This, Struck, Eichhorn, are intrigued by the distinction, this is again well known, by the distinction of the two different names of God that appear in the Bible, Elohim and the Tetragrammaton, the four-lettered name of God. They pick up on this, they're intrigued by it, they begin to sort of realize that there are possibly two very different textual traditions. Of course, it gets much more complicated and much more interesting later on. And it's Eichhorn who realizes the distinction of the E and the J, just use the shorthand, extended beyond the Pentateuch, which is exactly what then makes him realize that, oh, well, if it extends beyond the Pentateuch, it can't be Moses. And therefore, at that point, he begins to say, this is definitely written later. Okay, so there's a development here in terms of the argument. This is exactly what suggests for him a post-Mosaic hand. It's these various insights, the textual witnesses, and again, the Samaritan, of course, but the Septuagint and other such witnesses, meaning the different versions, and now the whole question of the different sources. This is very much what served as the pathway, the major pathways forward in the development of biblical criticism. Spinoza doesn't have a hand in any of this. So that's, again, yet another kind of argument. But I see that, and I'm going to now sum up or conclude really. I've said what I've said. I've laid out a series of arguments. I'm certainly interested in hearing your feedback. So in a word, in a sentence, Spinoza is unquestionably a great thinker. Okay, that's not my interest to him. I'm nowhere touching on that. He contributed immeasurably in the realm of philosophy, etc. But for all of his greatness, I am not inclined to view him, to answer the question that we began with at the beginning, rhetorical or not, I am not inclined to view him as a major figure in the history of biblical criticism.